All right, everyone. Welcome to session 5 of 6 weeks to a new marriage. We are in the home stretch here as we have just tonight, and then we'll wrap things up with this series next Wednesday night. So we want to thank you guys for being here again, and we hope you'll come next week because we'll have kind of tie a bow around everything, and then we'll have some questions for you guys about just next steps for the marriage ministry here at Southwest. And we really want to be able to provide you guys with content that is helpful and practical to your life and marriage. So thank you guys for just coming and participating in this class series. And tonight we are going to take our conversation of the peace cycle and go a little bit deeper into the peace cycle. How do we really work on regulating our internal distress and move from pain into peace? And the real cool thing about this model is your peace is not something that is outside of you, right? It is something that comes from within. Okay, so a brief rundown for those of you that may have not been with us every week. We introduced this model. This is based on a model called restoration therapy. And so in the first session, we looked at the idea of usness, that when we get married, the idea is to create this special bond between us, that while we both retain our individuality, we want to create something unique between us that becomes our connectedness, right? And then in session 2, we talked about because we live in a broken, fallen world, what happens? We all have times that we get triggered, that our pain gets stirred up. And when we're in pain, we tend to either blame or shame. And then out of that, our coping becomes we either start controlling things or we kind of bail out and internalize and avoid things, right? And then we followed that up in session 3, talking a little bit more about the pain cycle and specifically what triggers you in your pain. And then last week, we introduced what's called the peace cycle, this way of when we actually tap into God's truth in our lives, we can really ground ourselves in His peace, right? That we want to choose truth over lies. And we're going to take that concept a little bit further tonight by talking specifically about some of the regulating techniques in the peace cycle. So let's go to the next slide here. So we live in a world where there's all these different messages in our life, right? And so sometimes when we've been in a season of life when things have been hard, one of the worst things that can happen is we begin to lose hopefulness. We begin to lose the belief that anything can be different. Have any of you guys ever started a New Year's resolution? Yeah? How many days or weeks does it last before you're kind of back to the old bad habits again? A couple weeks, maybe? The research usually says it's about 2.5 weeks in, you know, when we try to. So basically what I do is I create 2 lists now. I do the goals list, and then I have like the absolution list. I'm not even going to bother with trying to set myself up for failure. I'm just going to embrace these are areas that I'm not going to change, right? That's probably good for my mental health rather than, psyching myself up and then failing 3 weeks in. But in all seriousness, we've got to be able to look at in the peace cycle, first we have to believe in the possibility of change, right? A lot of change starts with our internal conflict. We have ambivalence. We feel more than one way about something. And when we begin to believe that we can't change and our spouse can't change and our marriage can't change, that's often when we get stuck. And frankly, guys, that's part of the pain cycle talking. The pain cycle keeps us in bondage, keeps us in the same bad habits and our ways of thinking and our ways of doing that really keep us from growing personally, that can keep our marriage from growing. So the peace cycle is really about believing in change. And if we move to the next slide here, this is a passage we looked at one piece of this last week. Let's look at this in a bit bigger context. This is in Romans 12. It says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what is God's will, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." So God created us in this very unique way that He gave us a brain, right? He gave us emotions. He gave us a body. He gave us free will. And so when we get passages like this that challenge us to take on a new perspective. Part of how God designed us as physiological beings is the way that our brains work, the way that our brains work with our bodies. The more we reinforce these messages of truth in the peace cycle, what begins to happen? Right? We begin to create new neural connections in our brain that I think that's part of the mystery of how the Holy Spirit can work. When I take truth and I put truth into my brain and I reinforce truth over and over again, what does that do? That begins to regulate my emotions, and that allows me to do what? Start making healthier choices. And so the Bible is full of instructions that are essentially saying, take on this new perspective. And part of how you'll adopt this new lifestyle is thinking differently, reinforcing those thoughts. That's going to regulate your emotions and then give you the capacity to do what? Be more consistent in your good behavior. Be more consistent in your ability to live a holy life. So tonight, the video is going to look at the peace cycle a little bit further, and he does a good job of, kind of layman's version of what's happening inside of our bodies. And then after the video, we'll have a few more thoughts about that.
And I love where we are. We talked about that pain stuff, which is just no fun. But it's important to get some awareness around. And now we've moved into last session talking about peace, the peace cycle. And that's a good word, isn't it? We don't live in a culture where peace is very frequent or easy to find. I mean, we just chaotic, hectic, fast-paced lives, running from place to place. And it's hard to find that peace. And yet God promised, and Jesus came so that we could experience His peace here on earth in abundance. In our lives, and most importantly, maybe even in our homes and in our relationships. And so we want to move from pain into peace. And as fun as it sounds to make that move, and as excited as we are about getting there, the reality is it's just not easy to do. I mean, between the last taping and this one, I've been messing around on my BlackBerry trying to resolve a problem somewhere that, pushed all of my hot buttons and spun me right back into my old ways of coping and the ways that I handle situations when I get off kilter, and hadn't felt much peace around that. And I know I'm supposed to be in that peace cycle. So how do I get from this pain place into that peace place and stay there? And when I'm there and something comes to knock me out, how do I get back? Well, it takes some effort, some real intentional effort and energy. And that's what we're going to talk about this session.
There's nothing really more important than this session in making that transition. I mean, it's a nice idea to talk about your pain, and there's something cathartic about that, and that's a good thing to get some insight on. And it's really hopeful to talk about, well, if I could make this peace cycle. But the transition where you, at the point of attack, where you feel under the gun, when you get all these emotions activated, that you feel unwanted, or you feel unloved, or you feel unsafe. We talked before about how your brain is used to just reacting and responding automatically. God created us with a brain that is miraculous in many ways. And what we've learned about the brain is remarkable in the last 20 years. But basically, one of the main tenets that we've learned is that the midbrain, which holds a lot of our emotional processing, is very different, works very differently than the forebrain, which holds most of our rational thinking processes. If we were able to be very rational, always in our emotions and what we thought about and what we were planning about and how we were going to reason out conflict, then maybe we wouldn't have these great cycles that go on within us. But the fact is that our emotional brain exerts a lot of power over our brain. And it's like your rational brain and your emotional brain are really battling to see who's going to have predominance. Now, you're not going to lose either one of them, but it is going to be a question of which brain is going to be more powerful in a pinch, when you get activated, when you get upset, when you get in conflict, when you get that hot button pushed. And what we know, what neuroscience has told us, is it's the emotional brain. The midbrain is the more powerful. Just left pound for pound, in a fight, your emotional brain will win every time. And it's partly because It's what you're used to doing. It's what you've been doing and learning 10,000, 20,000 times over and over again. Those ideas that you were taught as a child, those ideas that you were taught growing up, those feelings and emotions that you've had and those responses that you've had all the time that you've been married, they've just like worn a rut, a super highway, if you will, in your brain of how to respond. That's why we can look at one of these pain cycles and say it's very, very predictable that you'll feel and respond in the same way. Now, what we want to do is to tell you, what we want to do as spouses, we want to say, I want my partner to make me feel differently. If he or she would just behave differently, that's what would make me feel better. And then I would be able to operate in the peace cycle. Well, we have news for you. That's, both of you will stay in that pain cycle a long, long time if you stay there. To be able to get out of the pain cycle, you have to take control. It's a very scriptural principle. It's that Romans passage that we mentioned in the last session about that you need, if you're going to really not be conformed to the world and be transformed, you have to renew your mind. When we talk about Ephesians 4, 22 and 23, Paul talks about it again. He says, you weren't taught this way. You've been taught that you have to take off the old self and by the renewing of your mind, put on the new self, which is headed toward those things, the likeness and image of Christ. It takes work. In other words, by the renewing of your mind, you have to change your brain. In our language, it's the idea that you have to regulate yourself. You have to put on the new self. You have to take responsibility for your half of the cycle to change yourself so you can get over here and experience that peace. So that's what we're really talking about when we come to something called the 4 steps. The 4 steps are nothing but a guide to help you self-regulate and take off the old self and put on the new self. Well, what are those 4 steps? Well, just like in the book, the first step is say what you feel. And when we say what you feel, we mean say it out loud. Because we know in the brain that if you just try to think what you feel, your emotional brain will take over. Because you can think much more quickly than what you can speak. And if you actually say it out loud, I feel unloved, I feel unwanted, I feel disrespected, I feel unappreciated, you're actually giving your brain a leg up. You're actually saying it out loud where your brain has to hear itself. You're putting that information in a different part of your brain so your brain can actually reason it out in a different way. It gives us the initial step in changing that pain cycle into something new. The second step is to say what you normally do. Now, when we say what you do, we're saying say it out loud. So when I feel unloved, when I feel unwanted, when I feel unappreciated, what do I normally do? Well, I withdraw, I perform, I get angry, I blame people, I shame myself, I go have a drink, I try to avoid conflict with the other person, I withdraw to punish. Whatever that is with you, you say what you do, and you're actually notifying your brain, I know your tricks. I know what you do. I know what you do automatically, and I'm naming that so I don't do it automatically. Does that make sense? Well, okay, so then we're to step 3, and here's where the great divide comes. Here's where the great divide comes, is that we have to decide what it is that you're going to believe about yourself. We want our spouse to make us feel differently. Well, actually, it's us that needs to take that responsibility. It's us that needs to be able to put on that new self. You have to say the truth. That's the third step. You have to say the truth to yourself. the Holy Spirit and the Bible are a great resource for you to draw on to understand who you are. Trusted friends and counselors are going to be a great resource to tell you who you are. But you know, those things won't make a difference unless you're willing to take it in yourself. You can reject those things so easily unless you're willing to take responsibility. And it's sort of like parenting yourself. It's sort of like saying, I've got to take charge of making sure that I take care of my own heart and say the truth and speak the truth into my own heart. Well, that truth will emotionally have an effect on you. Because you're feeling all these things of feeling unloved or unwanted or feeling like you don't belong or whatever it is that you have as a hot button. You feel those things and you get activated. When you say the truth and speak that truth into you, it emotionally changes the frame. It's just that framework that we were talking about in Ephesians, where if you say what you feel, say what you normally do, you take off the old. When you say the truth, you're putting on the new. And then the fourth step, if you really listen to the truth, then you can do the fourth step, which is say what you'll do differently. In other words, say what a good constructive choice would be for your relationship. What would be the choice that you were built to do, the way that God designed you, the way that you work together well with a spouse? That's the element of the actions in the peace cycle that we're talking about. Well, following those four steps is not always easy. So we want to just kind of illustrate how we work through that. And so Elle and Stephanie, you were telling me about a conflict that y'all had just last night where y'all were trying to talk about an issue, and what kind of circumvented the issue was a discussion about, well, like Elle, you were telling Stephanie, well, you know, this is the background that you came from, Stephanie, and Stephanie, you were trying to say, well, you know, you have issues too, and y'all went right into this pain cycle.
Absolutely, and we stayed there all night. Actually, you know, just slept on it. But yeah, you're right. When I was trying to say, well, let's talk about this, and she said no, and we were just, there was a difference. What we received as far as what is the issue at hand. And so we just couldn't come up with an agreement as to what was an issue in our past that was pretty different for us, that we would always argue about. Now with us, you know, there hasn't been an affair, there hasn't been drug abuse or physical abuse, but there are a lot of little fights.
Yeah, which illustrates perfectly what we talk about with this cycle, is that it can be on the big issues, it can be on the issues that don't mean anything. It can be literally talking about trying to find an issue that causes you to slip back in this cycle. It's because it's not whether you talk about the money or the kids or the big stuff, it's whether you slip into this cycle. So something about that discussion made you fall into this cyclical process, huh? So Stephanie, however you got there, when this discussion started going on, what did you feel?
Unloved, unsafe, controlled, which is I have a big hot button when we were discussing her. A lot of people have their little small buttons. Mine's a big hot button. Unaccepted and not measuring up. Yeah. So classically, these things that hit in your pain cycle. So even if Elle had good intentions by what he was trying to bring up, whatever it did, it hit that emotional hot button with you, and you were stimulated. And in the second step, what did you do when you felt that way? I got angry. I withdrew and got defensive.
Yeah, so you were classically into that framework where it was going on. Elle, how about you? You know, when things started going south in this discussion, what was it that you were feeling?
Well, when she starts to withdraw, I'm thinking, okay, we're not going to get anywhere if she withdraws. and she's becoming defensive, and it's like anything I say, she's just going to shut me out. It's not going to want to just, okay, let's be mature about this and let's discuss this. Instead of getting angry, why don't we just talk about this? And I think I even said, let's just lay it on the table. You know, what is it? So I felt like I was being disrespected. And, you know, kind of like unwanted, as a matter of fact, feeling unwanted, I went to my little boy's bed and I laid down with him for a little bit. Yeah, and so...
You were emotionally trapped into that, you were activated, and then what do you normally do? Step 2, what do you normally do when you feel that way?
Well, I try to just kind of regroup my thoughts and said, okay, let me take a different angle at this. Because I always thought I was discouraged. I'm thinking, okay, I've got to bring this back. And so there are times when I got to say, okay, look, I'm sorry, redo this. I didn't last night because I was pretty upset.
Yeah, and that's what I want to know. When you're upset, when you got this emotional activation going on,
well,
what do you normally do?
I hold grudges, and I will play that silent game. I will play that silent game because I do get very defensive. But I hold grudges, and that stems when I was a kid. I would hold grudges, which stem from my dad and stem from his dad. Is a silent treatment, and I will get very sarcastic.
You see how this old self has that tendency to drive us right into this cycle and destroy our marriage, because when you're holding these grudges and defensive and sarcastic, what are you more likely to feel, Stephanie?
Unloved, unsafe, controlled, unaccepted, and not measuring up.
And then when you get activated to take these steps of being angry, defensive, and withdrawing, what are you more likely to feel?
Again, disrespect.
Yeah.
And unwanted and discouraged.
Yeah, exactly. That's how the cycle works. So when we say we want to take off, this is the accurate representation of the old self. We want to take this off. And we're to step 3. What's the real truth about you, Stephanie?
I am valuable and I am adequate.
Absolutely. And when you say those things about yourself in the face of this, when the rubber meets the road, if you would have been able to say, yeah, I know that I'm loved, I know that I'm accepted, I'm valuable, I'm adequate, what would you have been able to do differently in that situation?
I can be more forgiving, I can be loving, and I can be peaceful.
Yeah. Could you have seen yourself last night if you would have been able to say that? If you would have been able to say, you know, what I feel, Elle, is that I feel unloved, unsafe, and I'm feeling like I'm being controlled right now. And what I normally do when I feel that way is I get angry and I get defensive and I withdraw. But the truth about me, Elle, is that I'm loved, accepted, valuable, and adequate. What do you think you would have done differently how do you think that would have changed the argument last night?
I would have had a more loved and appreciated, respected husband, and with my reactions of feeling loved, and just like I said, just renewing of my mind and my spirit, all that.
Yeah. And how about you, Elle? What's the truth that you have to integrate for yourself? If you say, okay, I normally I feel disrespected, I feel unwanted, I feel discouraged. What I normally do is I hold grudges, I'm defensive, I'm sarcastic. But what's the truth about you?
Well, the fact of the matter is I am loved. I know that all too well. I am loved, and I know I am appreciated. I also feel that there is respect for me, and that encourages me.
Yeah. And if you're able to make that step, if you're able to say those things to yourself at those crucial times, what would you be able to do?
For one, I would have slept a lot better. I wouldn't have lost as much sleep as I did. But you know, I wouldn't have been as defensive. Then I was defensive last night. But again, I would have been as Stephanie, forgiving and very respectful of her feelings and her thoughts and what she was going through.
Yeah. Now, it's easy after the fact to say, okay, now I've got to make this transition And it is helpful for those of you that are learning how to do this to analyze your fights, even where you failed, going over them and over again to remember saying, what should I have done at the crucial point to make a difference in this argument? That's how you learn eventually to come to the 4 steps while you're in the argument, while you're feeling this disrespected or unloved and unsafe, to be able to say, wait, Stephanie, I want to tell you that I feel disrespected. Step 1, I feel disrespected. I feel unwanted and I feel discouraged. What I normally do when I feel that way is I get really upset, I hold grudges, I get defensive, and I start being sarcastic with you. But I want to tell you that the truth is, right now, when I'm so activated, right now, I know that I am loved. I'm taking responsibility for my own appreciation. I'm respected. I'm a respectable person. And I'm going to act encouraged. Therefore, what I'm going to choose to do differently is I'm going to be non-defensive with you. I'm going to be seeking to connect with you and be forgiving with you. And I'm going to be respectful of what's going on with you. Of course, that sets the stage beautifully. When L does that, he's taking responsibility for himself, but what it does is it signals to Stephanie, oh, we're going to do these 4 steps. This is an opportunity for me to see if I want to take responsibility for that. But even if Stephanie wants to hold on to this pain cycle, it's going to have a different result because L is saying, I'm not going to engage in my pain cycle anymore. You want to change your marriage? Change yourself. You want your marriage to put on the new self? You got to first be willing to do that with yourself. One more thing that I need to let all of you know is that Sean said this is not an easy transition. Breaking new pathways in your brain is not an easy proposition. Putting on the new self is not an easy thing to do. It takes practice and repetition over and over and over again. The more you practice, the better you will get at knowing your cycles and knowing how to make that transition and interrupt this pain cycle and supplant it with the peace cycle. How much practice does it take? Well, we literally think it takes you about 50 or 60 times going through the 4 steps for you to accurately learn your cycles so that you can interrupt that cycle. Actually, every argument that you have can be now an opportunity to actually take off the old self and put on the new self.
Practicing these 4 steps is the key. Practice, practice. Terry said 50 to 60 times. Here's a neat tip for you. You don't have to practice in your marriage. The reality is your kids can push your hot buttons, your boss at work can push your hot buttons. Practice there. I mean, something happens at work, you feel your button get pushed, go into your office and practice. Go over the 4 steps. What I normally do at this point is, everything that Terry just taught you. Practice those. It doesn't have to be in your marriage. The 50 or 60 will get past a lot quicker if you realize that lots of people are pushing these buttons. I need to change who I am, change the way I interact, put on that new self so that I can behave differently. You just heard us talk about a pretty critical moment in this 5-day process. The move from the pain cycle to the peace cycle. The 4 steps that it takes to make that happen, to transform your mind, to renew your mind so that you can have a new marriage. You're going to have to practice this. You may not get through everybody there in the group, but do what you can. If you can get a couple of couples up there, just practicing the 4 steps over and over. What do I feel? What do I do when I feel that way? And then the next 2 steps to the new portion. Practice in the group. It'll help you.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit, just to kind of fill in some blanks, about the brain and how we get to this place in our pain. And then Lauren's going to talk to us some about some self-regulation techniques. How do we get regulated so that we can move into peace? So just what was it, Sean? Is that his name? I don't even remember what his name is. Sean. What he was just talking about is that our stressors, our activations, can happen in a lot of different places in our lives. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about what does stress look like in your life. It's very subjective, so we need to be aware of what things kind of push our hot buttons. So things like obviously within ourselves, our mental state, our emotions. Things about our body. How many of you get really cranky when you're in pain, like physical pain? I do, for sure. I'm not a very nice person when I'm in pain. But also our behaviors, some of the things we do, like not sleeping well, having insomnia, not being rested. All of those things can activate our pain cycle before we ever walk in the door in our house to engage with our spouse. So you want to know those things, and you want to be addressing those things so that you are the healthiest person you can be in all those other ways, and then be able to be healthy in relationships. But also, as he just mentioned, at work as well, people in our workplace, situations that we deal with, all of those things can also activate this pain cycle. So you want to be really aware of those things, and maybe there are others that are individual to you, but being aware of those so that you know how to manage them when they come. So what does stress look like in your life? And then the other thing, the next slide, please, is just the physiology of the brain. I'm not going to talk a ton about this in huge detail, but a lot of the things that I will tell my clients about their brain is this idea that there's only enough power to run one part of it at a time, either your logical brain or your survival brain. So when the lights are out in one place, the energy's going somewhere else. So when that survival brain is on, or that fire alarm turns on, we don't think straight, we are not very eloquent with our words, we are not very kind. And so the whole point of getting to the peace cycle is you have to be able to regulate your brain so that you can think through what's the truth, that step 3 that he was mentioning. So when we lose this prefrontal or higher thinking, that's what regulates our brain, we react out of this primitive or survival mechanism. I'm sure you guys maybe have heard the fight or flight response. That very much is our survival mechanism. And I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily think I have to survive a disagreement with my husband. But sometimes my brain might tell me I need to survive this if it's emotional enough. Other things that happen, like the central nervous system, we get our perception gets narrowed. We don't remember as well. Have any of y'all tried to ever have an argument and you can't remember the details of it afterwards? It's because your prefrontal cortex is offline and you're not going to remember the details. You might not even remember what you fought about. Has that ever happened to you guys? Happened to me. Like a week later, you're like, what was that fight even about? I don't even know. So it definitely affects our memory, affects our ability to learn new things. And then other things like our muscular system, we tense, we're ready for action. We may get, our jaw gets clenched and we're bracing again for that fight or flight response. And lastly, all those autonomic nervous system things that happen, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen level, sweaty palms, our digestive system changes, and we're getting in that fight or flight mode. So what we're going to talk about, what Lauren's going to talk about is how do we regulate that? How do we renew our mind and create those new pathways, getting from this old pathway, which is the pain, into the peace, because our brain can change, it can learn if we are doing those repetitions. What do you say, 50 times at least? Yeah. So you have to have 50 fights in order to figure this out. So start counting today. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, doing this over and over creates that new pathway, and it is possible with a lot of practice and doing some of the things that we're going to talk about, including the 4 steps that he just mentioned. You got anything else you want to say, Jeff? Okay. All right. Now it's Lauren's turn. Tell us how to do it, Lauren.
I am not the expert. Maybe I am the expert. Okay, so how do we actually do this? Doing it is harder than learning it. It's easier said than done. So we start off with having a shared regulation plan. I think this is something I spend a whole lot of time with a lot of my clients on, because we're going to get in fights, we're going to get activated, we're going to have these triggers or these buttons, and then we're going to start trying to do this stuff and we're not going to do it right, or our spouse is not going to do it right, or it's going to be a very awkward, kind of clumsy process as we are learning, and it can get more frustrating than feeling helpful at the beginning. So what this means with having the plan is talking before you ever get in a fight, before we're ever upset, about what we need when we get overwhelmed. When you feel your heart start racing, or your palms are getting sweaty, or you just know you're getting angry. Sometimes you can see your spouse, getting upset. There's different things that we need to calm down. And a lot of times what I see is that we've got two different roles in the relationship. We usually have a pursuer and a withdrawer. So this person wants to fix it right now. Like, we're going to talk about this. We're going to work it out. We're going to do the steps. We're going to get through this. And this poor little person is like, I need some time. And they are withdrawing, let me calm down. Let me get away. And then the pursuer is, we're going to fix this right now. And we get stuck in this horrible pattern where somebody's trying to run away, somebody's trying to fix it because we're both upset. And it does not go well a whole lot of times. So this beginning step is a huge piece. Like, when I get upset, I'm going to need to go to my room and calm down and do my deep breathing, or calm my emotional state down, get that rational brain back online before I can respond to you in a kind and nice way. And it's harder for that pursuer person to give that space and time for that one person to calm down, but it's a huge piece of working through a lot of these things, is just recognizing that your spouse may need something different. So we're going to talk about all this way before we're ever in a fight, way before this ever happens. I have a lot of people that are the withdrawers that like to run away and say they're calming down and never come back, and then never discuss the issue again. That does not work. That is not what this is. So I always tell them, we're going to put a time limit on it, and we're going to explain what we're doing. I am not trying to escape from you. I am overwhelmed. I am frustrated. I need to calm down. I need 15 minutes. I'm going to take a walk. I will come back to you, because that pursuer that wants to fix it and get it done can feel very abandoned when somebody is trying to run away. So we're going to know what the plan is. We're going to talk about it. We're going to respect our spouse. We're going to know what they need. We're going to know if we're a pursuer or a withdrawer, or maybe we do some of both, but figure those things out. And it really does help navigating these 4 steps go a little bit easier. So the plan, again, is the 4 steps. It is hugely helpful when you say it out loud. I have done this to myself, and when I say what I normally do is blah, 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 it's very alarming when you are calling yourself out. Normally I'm going to throw a fit, or I'm going to get real cranky. It does not sound good. So it is a self-accountability piece that really does help. Because we know what we do. We have done this over and over and over. So it really is important, that saying it out loud component. And then knowing that truth and being able to say that truth and choose that truth. And it may take us a little bit of time to calm down and get to the truth piece, but it's huge. And then you may be wondering why we gave you your brains. These are our stress balls, stress brains. They're a huge part of what we do. So part of calming down and regulating yourself is just your breathing. Your body cannot be in a state of distress and peace at the same time. So once we get distressed, we are trying to find the peace. So we need to calm down. So a lot of that's going to be the physical, just taking care of our breathing. So we've got, pretty much everybody's heard of deep breathing, in through your nose, out through your mouth. We've got this cool slide on triangle breathing. We just found this on YouTube. It's really cool. I think it's on the next slide, where you can just pull this app up and actually watch it. And you inhale while it grows, exhale, and you just kind of follow the pattern. And if you have a hard time regulating that yourself, just kind of sitting there and watching this and breathing through it, even for a minute, will really calm your physical body down. Using your stress brain, squeezing things is helpful, but there's something called bilateral stimulation, which is where we kind of move it from side to side. Can't do it with my microphone in my hand. But just the act of moving something from left side to right side connects the two parts of your brain, because sometimes we are offline. We are trying to reintegrate our brain, get it back into that rational, logical place. And so just using your body to help do that, you can wad up a Kleenex, a piece of paper, whatever you've got. Just move something kind of left to right. It really does help. So just finding something that you can do in the moment to help you, and just realizing that we are, it is that recognizing the old pattern, putting on the new of what am I going to choose to do that's new moving forward. So I'm not just stuck in this rut over and over and over. And then next slide, we have got some resources for you guys just on different apps or websites that will kind of help you with self-regulation. A lot of people will just kind of pick a favorite one that works for them. So it's either things that you watch or things that can, sometimes there's voices or different things that talk you through ways to calm yourself down. So all of these things are just really helpful in slowing the process down and working on your regulation.
One of the things that's important to keep in mind when you start to try to practice these things, it's not one of these things that you just do it a couple of times and it's easy, right? The main thing when you're starting a new regimen, like if you follow a lot of the stuff on Change Process, what it'll talk about is creating, our brain is kind of like, just absorbs negativity. It's like a sponge to negativity. And then with positivity or positive change, it's kind of like Teflon. It just wants to roll off. So you have to do like so much more work to create new neural connections in the brain, right? And so when we're looking at these strategies for self-regulation, it's not just take a couple of deep breaths. A lot of the research shows you need to do a minimum of like 10 cycles, 10 rounds to really get some kind of therapeutic effect out of deep breathing, right? I don't know. Do we have any mindfulness fans? Any of you guys practice mindfulness? So important. Mindfulness is it's really about changing your mood state. So sometimes people think of these practices like they're just completely out of left field. But if you get comfortable with it, if you just try it, if you just throw on like YouTube, mindfulness meditation, there's thousands of these things out there. And it's just really trying enough out with an open mind till you find something that could work for you. So you probably don't want to try 20 things at once, but try one or two. And then from there, move on. I mean, there's some Christian-based ones that are good. Abide, that kind of is like guided visualization stuff using Scripture. So there's ways to actually try to integrate some biblical truth along with this. And then just give yourself a lot of grace if it doesn't come easy initially. Because sometimes we think we'll just solve something pretty quickly if we just talk it through, if we just resolve the issue between us. But what this model is really showing, that a prerequisite to having meaningful dialogue with your partner is you first have to learn how to regulate yourself, right? Create your peace from within. Now we're in a position to have a heart and a disposition of peacemaking with each other. And so what's happening in the pain cycle is where usually one or both of us are activated. And so because that's happening, that emotional brain is driving the conversation, not the logical part. So that's very critical to practice these self-regulating techniques enough so that when it's time to come back together and process whatever we're doing, we can do it from more of a perspective of usness, right? Because we're both in a more regulated place, that the goal is not to win or the goal is not to... it's not a zero-sum game here. We're really mutually motivated to find something that is honoring to our differences. Okay, where are we at on time? So we just have a couple of minutes. So these might be more takeaway questions for you guys to be thinking about over the next week. So one is thinking through, how do you see yourself using the 4 steps as a tool to move from pain to peace in your relationship? The thing I was curious about is you're watching the video. Were you thinking, like, does this just seem like it's completely foreign, or is it actually possible for you to have that kind of a conversation with your spouse? right? Because it seems like if that's not been the culture of your relationship, it seems kind of odd to like do your 4 steps with your partner. But it's literally a way to kind of move you out of conflict and move you out of the topic-driven whatever we're dealing with to then do what? Put much more of a focus on what's happening inside of me right now and what's happening inside of you. So all the research shows that for change to happen in the relationship, there has to be empathy as part of that process. And what the peace cycle does is if you're being vulnerable and talking about your own stuff and then they're talking about theirs, now we're in a position to be peace seekers, right? Because we're not engaged in this conflict cycle. I'm getting to hear what your experience is. You're getting to hear mine. And then there's this ability to really honor and respect. Wow, I can see you're not the enemy, I'm not the enemy, right? What's happened is we're both good people who love each other. But when our pain gets activated, we become the worst versions of ourselves, right? And that tends to be what happens. The next question here, the other takeaway tonight, guys, if only you and not your spouse were to start using the 4 steps, what advantage might it have for your marriage, right? So all the research shows that if you change you, then you've changed the relationship, right? If there's a sequence of events that usually happen, if you just become healthier, less reactive, more calm, it's not a guarantee that the other person's going to join you in that. But it sure extends the olive branch, doesn't it? If you begin to model and live this out, right? So listen, guys, really hopeful and prayerful that in the coming week you'll be thinking about this material. Next week we're going to try to kind of tie a bow on all these concepts and also have some opportunities to kind of take some of these concepts further for those that might be interested. But thank y'all again for joining us after a long day. I'm going to pray us out, and then we'll let you guys go on with the rest of your evening.